There is a sound that does not exist yet. It lives somewhere between the hum of a Marshall amplifier at full volume and the silence of a man sitting alone at 3 in the morning, headphones pressed against his ears, rewinding the same 4 bars of tape for the 11th time. It is not a chord, it is not a riff. It is something closer to a feeling that has never been translated into vibration before. And in the spring of 1968, one musician was willing to destroy everything he had built to find it. But the cost of chasing a sound that lives only inside your head is something no one warns you about. To understand what happened inside the recording sessions for Electric Ladyland, you have to understand what came before. By early 1968, Jimi Hendrix was already the most talked-about guitarist on the planet. 2 albums had landed in less than a year. Are You Experienced had rewritten the rules of what a debut could sound like. Axis, Bold as Love had pushed further, layering studio techniques over songs that blurred the line between psychedelia and pure blues emotion. Critics were running out of adjectives. Audiences were filling arenas. The Jimi Hendrix Experience, with Noel Redding on bass and Mitch Mitchell on drums, was one of the highest-grossing live acts in the world. From the outside, everything looked like momentum. But Jimi was already restless. According to biographies and accounts from those closest to him during this period, the sound he heard inside his own imagination had outgrown what 3 musicians and a conventional studio setup could produce. He talked about orchestras of electric guitars. He described textures that layered backwards tape over live drums, voices that floated through stereo space like smoke drifting through a room. He wanted the studio itself to become an instrument. It's not just a place where instruments were recorded. The people around him listened. Some understood. Most did not. And that gap between what Jimi heard in his mind and what anyone else could comprehend would become the central conflict of the next 8 months. The recording sessions began at Olympic Studios in London during the winter months and quickly moved to the record plant in New York City. The record plant was relatively new at the time, yet equipped with 12-track recording capability that was considered cutting edge. Jimi had worked with 4-track machines on his first album. Now he had 3 times the space to layer sound, and even that would not be enough. Engineer Eddie Kramer, who had worked with Jimi since the London sessions for Are You Experienced, became the closest thing to a translator between the sound in Jimi's head and the physical reality of magnetic tape. Biographies describe their working relationship as intense, almost telepathic at times, but also exhausting. Jimi would describe what he wanted in language that was more poetic than technical. He would talk about colors instead of frequencies. He would say a guitar part needed to feel like underwater sunlight, or that the drums should sound like they were being played inside a cathedral made of glass. Kramer's job was to turn those visions into signal chains, microphone placements, and tape manipulations that captured something close to the impossible. But there was a problem building beneath the surface, and it had a name. Chas Chandler had discovered Jimi playing in a New York club in 1966 and brought him to London, where everything changed. Chandler was a former member of the Animals who had transitioned into management and production. He had an ear for hits, a talent for shaping raw ability into commercial form, and a practical understanding of how the music industry worked. He co-managed Jimi alongside Michael Jeffrey, and he had produced the first 2 Experience albums with efficient precision. Sessions were focused, budgets were respected, songs were completed and released on schedule. Chandler understood the value of a 3-minute single. He knew that radio play drove album sales, that album sales drove tour bookings, that tour bookings sustained careers. His approach had worked brilliantly for the first 2 records, but what Jimi wanted to do with the 3rd album did not fit inside that framework. The tension started small. A session that was supposed to last 4 hours would stretch to 12. A guitar overdub that Chandler considered finished would be erased and re-recorded 7 times. Jimi would invite other musicians into the studio without warning, jamming for hours on ideas that might never become songs. burning through expensive studio time while Chandler watched the budget expand beyond anything they had planned. According to accounts from those who witnessed these sessions, the atmosphere in the studio shifted depending on who was in the room. When Chandler was present, there was an unspoken pressure to be productive, to move toward completed recordings. When Chandler stepped out or was absent, the sessions became looser, more experimental, more unpredictable, and sometimes more brilliant. One particular night captures the dynamic perfectly. Jimi had been working on a track, layering guitar parts for hours, building a wall of sound that kept growing more complex. Chandler reportedly listened for a while, then asked when the song would be finished. Jimi looked at him and said it was not a song yet. It was still becoming something. Chandler, according to multiple biographical sources, understood in that moment that his role in this process was ending. The producer who had shaped a raw talent into a global phenomenon could not shape what that talent was becoming. The vision had outgrown the vessel. Chandler's departure from the Electric Ladyland sessions was not a single dramatic exit. It was gradual, a slow withdrawal driven by frustration and the honest recognition that he and Jimi were no longer speaking the same creative language. Some accounts describe arguments. The others describe quiet conversations where both men acknowledge the gap between them without anger. What is consistent across most sources is that Chandler cared about Jimi as a person and as an artist, and leaving was painful for both of them. But Jimi could not compress what he was hearing into neat, radio-friendly packages, and Chandler could not watch resources being consumed by a process that felt, from his perspective, dangerously open-ended. When Chandler stepped away, Jimi effectively became his own producer, and that is when the sessions entered a different dimension entirely. Without Chandler's structured oversight, the record plant became Jimi's laboratory. Sessions would begin at midnight and end at dawn. Musicians would arrive, play for hours, and leave without knowing whether their contributions would survive the final mix. The guest list during these months reads like an encyclopedia of late 1960s musical talent. Members of Traffic, Jefferson Airplane, and various jazz ensembles passed through the studio. Some played on tracks that made the album. Others played on recordings that were never released. The line between a formal session and an informal jam became invisible. But here is the detail that most casual histories overlook. The chaos was not chaos. Jimi knew exactly what he was looking for, even when no one else in the room could identify it. He would let musicians play freely, recording everything. He'd then spend hours alone with Kramer listening back to the tapes, isolating moments, sometimes just a single phrase or a 2-second texture that contained the quality he was chasing. He was mining raw material from collaborative improvisation, and then sculpting it with the precision of someone who understood every frequency, every overtone, every way that sound behaves when it moves through space and hits magnetic tape. The sprawling sessions were not a lack of discipline. They were a different kind of discipline, one that required patience and an almost supernatural ability to hear finished music inside hours of unfinished recordings. The technical innovations that emerged from these sessions were staggering. Jimi and Kramer experimented with phasing, flanging, reverse tape effects, and stereo panning in ways that had rarely been attempted in popular music. They manipulated tape speed to shift pitch, creating guitar tones that existed outside the normal range of the instrument. They used the studio's mixing board as a creative tool, riding faders during playback to create dynamic shifts that could not be replicated in a live performance. On certain tracks, the guitar was recorded through multiple amplifiers simultaneously, each set to different levels of distortion, then blended together to create a composite tone that was richer and more complex than any single amplifier could produce. The track that best represents this obsession is the one that became the album's centerpiece. A 15-minute composition that Jimi had been developing in various forms for over a year, reworking it constantly, never satisfied, always hearing one more layer that needed to be added. The recording required dozens of overdubs, multiple sessions spread across weeks, and a level of attention to sonic detail that pushed everyone involved to their limits. Kramer later described certain sessions where Jimi would focus on a single guitar tone for an entire evening, adjusting amplifier settings by fractions of a degree, changing the angle of a microphone by inches, searching for a specific harmonic quality that he could hear in his imagination, but that kept eluding the physical equipment. Meanwhile, outside the studio, the pressure was mounting from every direction. Management wanted a finished album. The record label wanted a release date. Tour promoters were booking shows that required the band to leave New York and perform, which meant leaving the studio, which meant leaving the work unfinished, which meant the sound Jimi was chasing would have to wait. The business machinery of a successful rock career does not pause because an artist is in the middle of a creative breakthrough. It keeps moving, demanding product, demanding appearances, demanding the version of the artist that audiences have already paid to see. And Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell felt the strain differently. Mitchell, the drummer, was more adaptable to the extended studio experimentation. His jazz-influenced playing style made him comfortable with improvisation and open-ended musical exploration. Redding, the bassist, found the sessions increasingly difficult. According to various accounts, he felt marginalized as Jimi took more control of the bass parts himself or invited other musicians to play them. The democratic structure of a three-piece band was dissolving into something more like a solo project with collaborators, and Redding's frustration grew as the sessions dragged on. The interpersonal tensions were real, but they existed alongside something equally real. The music that was emerging from these sessions was unlike anything that had been recorded before. Track by track, the album was assembling itself into a double-record statement that spanned blues, jazz, psychedelia, funk, and pure sonic experimentation. Some songs were concise and devastating. Others sprawled across extended improvisations that rewarded patient listening with moments of extraordinary beauty and power. The range was enormous, and holding it all together was Jimi's conviction that these sounds belonged next to each other, that the blues and the avant-garde and the soulful ballad and the distorted freakout were all expressions of the same musical impulse viewed from different angles. There's a moment that several people who were present in the studio have described independently, though the specific details vary slightly between accounts. It was late at night, deep into a session that had been running for many hours. Most of the extra musicians had left. The studio was nearly empty. Jimi was sitting alone with his Stratocaster plugged into an amplifier, playing at very low volume, almost whispering through the instrument. He was working through a chord progression that would eventually appear on the album, but at that moment it was still raw, still unformed. Kramer was in the control room, and he quietly started the tape machine without telling Jimi. What he captured in those minutes was something private, a musician alone with his instrument and his thoughts, playing not for an audience or a recording but for himself, searching through sound for something he could not name but knew existed. Whether that specific recording made it onto the final album is a matter of debate among historians and archivists, but the moment itself captures the essence of what Electric Ladyland was about. It was a man chasing a sound that lived only in his inner ear, willing to spend hundreds of hours in a studio to bring it across the border from imagination into physical reality. The mixing process was its own ordeal. Jimi's vision for the stereo presentation of the album was extremely specific, and he wanted sounds to move through the stereo field, to create a three-dimensional listening experience that would reward headphone listening. He and Kramer spent weeks mixing, then remixing again. Certain tracks went through dozens of mix iterations before Jimi was satisfied. Others were mixed, approved, then reconsidered and remixed days later when Jimi heard something in his memory that did not match what was on the tape. The record label was growing impatient. The budget had expanded far beyond initial projections. Studio time at the record plant was not cheap, and the hours Jimi was consuming represented a significant financial investment that needed to be recouped through album sales. There were conversations, some described as tense, about deadlines and delivery dates and the practical reality that a double album needed to be manufactured, distributed, and promoted on a timeline that the music industry machinery demanded. Jimi pushed back against every attempt to rush the process. Not with anger or arrogance, but with the quiet insistence of someone who understood that what he was creating would either be right or it would be wrong, and that no external schedule could determine when right had been achieved. This was not perfectionism in the neurotic sense. It was something closer to integrity, a refusal to release music that did not match the sound he heard when he closed his eyes and listened to the finished album playing inside his own mind. When Electric Ladyland was finally completed and released in October of 1968, the reaction was divided. Critics praised the ambition, but questioned the sprawl. Some reviewers felt the double album format was self-indulgent, that a tighter single record would have been more effective. Others recognized immediately that something unprecedented had been achieved, that the album represented a quantum leap in what was possible within the format of popular recorded music. Commercial response was strong. The album reached #1 on the Billboard chart in the United States, driven partly by the single that preceded it, a reimagined version of a classic song that showcased the studio techniques Jimi had been developing throughout the sessions. But the commercial success was almost beside the point. What Jimi had actually accomplished during those months of obsessive recording was something that would take years, even decades, to fully appreciate. He had demonstrated that the recording studio could be a compositional tool as powerful as any instrument. He had shown that a rock musician could think and work with the same level of sonic sophistication as the most advanced classical or electronic composers. He had proven that popular music and experimental art did not need to occupy separate categories. And he had done it by following a sound that existed only inside his own head, through months of grueling work, personal conflict, creative isolation, and the kind of single-minded dedication that looks like madness from the outside but feels like necessity from within. The cost was not small. The relationship with Chandler never fully recovered its original closeness. The dynamics within the experience were permanently altered, contributing to tensions that would eventually lead to the band's dissolution. The financial pressures created conflicts with management that would haunt Jimi for the remainder of his career. And the physical toll of spending months in recording studios, sleeping irregularly, pushing his body and mind past reasonable limits in pursuit of sonic perfection, he contributed to a pattern of exhaustion that those around him noticed with growing concern. Eddie Kramer, in interviews given years after the sessions, described the experience as the most creatively demanding and rewarding work of his career. He spoke about learning to trust Jimi's instincts even when the technical path forward was unclear, about discovering that the conventional rules of recording engineering were guidelines rather than laws, and that breaking them in the right way could produce results that following them could never achieve. He described Jimi as someone who operated on a level of musical perception that was difficult for even the most experienced professionals to fully comprehend. Someone who could hear the finished recording in his mind before a single note had been captured on tape and who would not stop working until the physical reality matched the internal vision. The legacy of Electric Ladyland extends far beyond its track listing. The album became a blueprint for how artists could use the recording studio as a creative environment rather than simply a documentation tool. Musicians across every genre studied its production techniques for decades. Producers and engineers referenced its innovations when developing their own approaches to sound design and mixing. The idea that an artist should have complete creative control over the recording process, which was controversial and expensive in 1968, became an accepted principle that shaped how albums were made for the next half-century. In the years following its release, as recording technology advanced and new generations of musicians encountered the album, the assessment shifted dramatically. What had seemed excessive to some contemporary critics came to be recognized as visionary. As the sonic details that Jimi had spent hundreds of hours perfecting revealed themselves more fully with each advance in playback technology, from vinyl to compact disc to high-resolution digital formats. The album kept giving up secrets because Jimi had buried them deep, knowing that future listeners with better equipment would eventually hear what he had always intended. There is something profound in the image of a musician alone in a studio at 4 a.m, chasing a sound that no one else can hear. It speaks to something fundamental about the creative process, about the gap between vision and execution, between what an artist imagines and what the physical world allows. Jimi Hendrix spent the spring, summer, and early autumn of 1968 inside that gap, building a bridge from one side to the other with nothing but magnetic tape, amplified wood and wire, and an inner certainty that the sound he was hearing was real, even if it did not yet exist in the world. He found it, not perfectly, because perfection is a destination that the most honest artists know they will never quite reach, but close enough to change what everyone else thought was possible, close enough to make engineers rethink their craft, close enough to make other musicians reconsider the boundaries they had accepted without question, close enough to prove that the recording studio was not just a room with equipment, but a place where imagination could be given physical form, where the sound inside one person's head could be translated into vibrations that would move through speakers and into the consciousness of millions of listeners for decades to come. Electric Ladyland was not just an album. It was evidence that the distance between an impossible idea and a finished masterpiece is measured not in talent alone, but in the willingness to keep working when everyone around you says it is finished, when the money is running out, when your closest collaborators cannot follow where you are going, when the only compass you have is a sound that no one else can hear. Jimi followed that compass, and the destination he reached is still ahead of most musicians who have tried to follow. But what happened next, after the album was complete, after the acclaim and the exhaustion, after the sound had been captured and released into the world, tells a different story. Because finding the sound you have been chasing does not end the chase. It only reveals the next sound, further away, harder to reach, demanding even more than the last one took. And that next sound was already calling.